When we last left off, Charles I had just dissolved Parliament, starting his 11-year personal rule. In his personal rule, he was forced to deal with the following issues: managing finances, effective religious leadership, and dealing with opposition. In this video, instead of going through year by year like I did in the previous one, I decided to format this video into 3 different parts, each of which will explain how he dealt with his issues. The most pressing issue facing Charles at the beginning of his personal rule was that of finance. After dissolving Parliament, he would have to find new ways of taxation, which without Parliament was widely disliked in England. Charles managed to secure taxation in a number of ways. However, I'll just be focusing on what I believe are the 5 most notorious and interested methods of taxation used by Charles. Following the humiliating wars with France and Spain, Charles was approximately £2 million in debt. Charles made peace with the two in 1629 with the Treaty of Susa and 1630 with the Treaty of Madrid. With no foreign conflict on the horizon, he could now focus on raising finances. Perhaps his most well-known method of taxation, ship money was usually a tax levied on coastal towns during time of war in order to build up England's navy. However, in 1634, Charles introduced it to all coastal towns despite not being at war. A year later, in 1635, he would introduce it to all counties in England. Its approximated income per annum was £300,000. Legally, all men in England who earned over £40 a year were required to be knighted. This was a medieval law that hadn't been used in hundreds of years. Those who failed to present themselves for knighthood would be fined. Its income by 1635 was around £175,000. The Crown had the right to control the estates of aristocratic orphans until they reached adulthood. This allowed the Crown to take any profit made from their lands, as well as sell it to the highest bidders. Its income by 1635 was £85,000. This was a fine levied on individuals who enclosed their farmland in order to keep in livestock. The fines totalled around £50,000. A law since 1066 which subjugated those who lived in royal forests to extra taxation and fines. Charles would expand the boundaries of royal forests to ensure as many people could be taxed. By 1640, its total income was £85,000. These were of course not all the ways of taxation and raising finances that Charles implemented during his personal rule, and not all were as bizarre. For example, he still collected tonnage and poundage, which brought in around £450,000 by 1635. If you're interested in the topic, I recommend more solo research. In terms of finances, though unpopular, Charles had successfully saved himself from bankruptcy. Parliament's aim throughout history was to raise finance for the Crown, and in return, their grievances would be addressed. With Parliament now dissolved, there was no longer any way for people to voice their complaints to the King. This would benefit Charles, as it meant there was not much opportunity to show opposition. There were, of course, exceptions to this. Although open opposition was rare, there were noticeable cases of resistance. Some examples include the Hampden Case in 1639, where John Hampden was tried for refusing to pay ship money. In his trial, 5 out of 12 judges ruled that the tax was unlawful, weakening Charles's right to collect it. The Providence Island Company supported Puritan parliamentary opposition to Charles in the 1630s and 1640s. The Puritan pamphleteers, Prine, Baswick and Burton, published pamphlets criticising the change in Charles's financial and religious policies. The 2 main ways in which Charles dealt with opposition in his personal rule were through Star Chamber and the Court of High Commission. Star Chamber was a council made up of members of Charles's personal advisers, whose job it was to attack those who disagreed with the king and government. The council would hand out punishment ranging from fines and imprisonment to branding, cutting the ears off of people, and sticking hot iron through people's tongues. The Court of High Commission was a court with the purpose to allow royal control over the church. As punishment, the commission could refer cases to Star Chamber. Charles's aims were simple when it came to religion. He wanted uniformity and conformity under his rule. It's important to recognise the religious differences in the kingdoms of England, Scotland and Ireland in this period, as it can be a complex topic. To majorly simplify it, The majority of England were Protestant Calvinist, though Charles himself was Arminian. There was a minority of Puritans, who, although they were few in number, they had a large influence within high ranks. And although Henry VIII had split with the Roman Catholic Church around 100 years previously, there still existed Catholics in the country. Like England, Scotland was a Protestant nation. However, the majority of its population were Presbyterians, a subgroup of Protestantism which operated without bishops. Like England, there was also a Catholic minority. Ireland during this period of time was a mess of its own, so much so that it deserves its own video in the future. To simplify Ireland though, there were three main groups: the Mere, or native Irish, who were still Catholic and made up the majority of the population; the Old English, who were descendant from pre-Reformation English settlers and were mostly Catholic; and the New English, who were Protestants who had arrived since the Reformation, and although they made up the minority, most political figures in Ireland were in this group. In England, William Laud, the Archduke of Canterbury, and with full support of the King, introduced a series of reforms to the English Church, which are nowadays referred to as Laudianism. Laud rejected the beliefs of Calvinism, and instead preferred the teaching of Arminianism. He thought English churches were too bland and wished to restore the beauty of holiness into Protestantism. Such reforms included the movement of the altar from the centre of the church to the east, the raising and installation of a railing around the altar, and the shift in focus on the importance of sacraments rather than the Word of God. His motto was Fora, which he used to represent his determination to carry out his doctrines and reforms. His reforms angered many Puritans, with around 16,000 fleeing to the Americas in the 1630s alone. Despite the Puritan reaction, his reforms saw widespread success in England. It wasn't disliked by many at all. It was only when Charles and Laud fought to introduce the reforms into Scotland where their real troubles would begin. Scottish Presbyterians followed a more traditionalist doctrine. Laudianism was viewed as Catholic-esque. In 1636, Charles published a new set of Scottish Articles of Religion. Two key articles stated that Charles could now impose new rules in Scotland without the assent of the Scottish General Assembly, and that a new prayer book was to be imposed on all Scots. In 1637, the new Book of Common Prayer was introduced into Scotland, and the following year, nonconformity was declared treasonous. Furious at Charles's actions, a rebel group called the Tables drew up a national covenant in February 1638. It was a promise to God which stated that the Scottish people would not conform to Charles's tyranny. Hundreds of thousands would sign the covenant. It would eventually escalate to military action and lead to the First Bishops' War in 1639, which only saw one significant engagement at the Battle of Bring of Dee in June, resulting in a Scottish victory. Back in England, and lacking funds for the war, Charles had no other option but to recall Parliament. After 11 long years of personal rule, it had finally come to an end. The short Parliament would meet in April 1640, and the rest will be discussed in the next and final video.